Good evening, students.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Okay. So I was trying to connect to the class, but I had some issue with the internet. Was experiencing low speed, so could not connect. So I moved to a new place now. Okay, I think it should work fine now. Okay. Let me open the files. Okay. Okay. So today we are going to begin with the new unit, that is the ecological anthropology. So beginning with 9.7. Okay, if you look into the syllabus of 9.7, you notice that we have biocultural adaptation. The syllabus says that biocultural adaptations, genetic and non-genetic factors. We have to learn about the various roles of genes, genetic factors, and non-genetic components with respect to the adaptations, or our ability to adapt to the new place or new environment. Okay, specifically, three such responses are given here, or three such conditions are given. So, man's physiological responses to environmental conditions like hot, desert, cold, high altitude. So, three conditions. So, high or elevated temperatures, how do we survive? And in terms of both physiological changes and as well as non-genetic changes, cultural changes. Okay, so to the high temperatures, low temperatures, and high altitudes. So three regions we have to learn with examples how humans actually adapt to these regions, and we have to look into both adaptations, which are considered to be more permanent changes or long-term changes versus more cultural changes. Okay, so that is the goal of this chapter. So let's focus on talking about, first of all, what few terms related to the humans adjustment or acclimatization or adaptation to the new environment. We look into that. First, I'll briefly explain the short term and more long term changes that happen in our body. Then we'll start talking about the different stress factors. Like we'll begin with the high altitude regions, how do we adjust, and then we'll move on to the temperature effects. Okay, right. So before getting into the specific details about it here, we all notice that humans actually survive in very different habitats, very different climatic conditions. Correct? So we notice them, people do live in the polar regions, people do live near the equator, so hot regions to the extremely cold regions. And also people do live in the sea level, okay, where the conditions are more suitable for our living, and people also live on the high altitude regions, highest mountains that you can think about. Okay, the regions close to that. We'll talk about that briefly. Some populations we consider here as examples. So humans have adapted to many of these regions. Okay, and but our biological system probably is not meant for that. Correct. But how are they able to survive in those extreme regions? So that is the focus of our understanding in this class. Okay, how humans are surviving in those environments which our body probably is not meant for. So the simple answer to this, I think humans respond to environmental stress factors in multiple ways, like physiologically, so changes that happen in our functioning of our body, and also by making changes to the growth, so changes that happen to the growth aspects of our body. So physiological is a functional aspect, how our body functions. Growth aspect is, how different patterns that we show in response to different conditions, different environmental conditions, so that it enhances our survival rate. Okay, so we're going to look into these components, what physiological changes happens and what other changes happen in us. So, but the concept of ecological anthropology or ecology part here is focusing on the concept that organisms adapt to the selecting environment. So, ecological anthropology. So, we are looking into the ecological aspect where how we adapt to the new environments. We definitely have, I think we studied in evolution, we actually have that plasticity or flexibility to adapt to the new environments. Okay, let's have a look at that. Correct. So before entering into the details, let's look into a definition given on ecological anthropology. I think I briefly told you that humans survive in variety of different environments and climatic conditions. Okay, and we do have certain adjustments that we can make to our physiological systems, our body functioning systems, and also to our growth patterns. Okay, in response to the environment around us. So as per the definition given by Seymour and Smith in 1986, so ecological anthropology, given this background I briefly told you, attempts to provide a materialist explanation of like human society and human culture. The society and culture both are the products of our adaptation to the given environmental conditions. So what is ecological anthropology does and what does ecological anthropology focuses on? So it focuses on human society and culture being the products of adaptation of humans to their environments. So our focus in this ecological anthropology is that, as I was telling you, that we want to understand how humans actually habituate to this new environments. So that is a major focus of ecological anthropology. So for this part of the class, I'm also going to provide you a handout or notes on this. Okay, for this I made a brief summary on what we are going to discuss in the class. So I provided a brief understanding on what we just talked about. So as part of the ecological anthropology, I was telling you that we try to actually understand how society and culture is designed in the process of us adapting to the new environments. So in this particular part, we focus on actually complex dynamics or relations between people and the environment. Okay, so culture is in a way defined by the environments we definitely live. And we also talked about that we have I think we are defined by particular components like land, climates, and the plants and animal species in the vicinities. We have certain controls on them, correct? So it's like the relationship that we build with things around us with respect to the environment. What type of plants or crops we grow, what type of animals we take care of. I think these are also defined by the environmental adaptation by humans. So let's see what are those components that actually change over a period of time, and what is the main idea about ecological anthropology. Okay, then I'll come to the idea of cultural adaptations as part of it, and in the few given stress factors, environments, how we adapt to it. Okay, before even getting into those details, a few terms I would like to introduce here. So one is acclimatization and adaptability. Do both acclimatization and adaptability mean the same? I've seen in once the exam, they asked the difference between these two terms. Is acclimatization and adaptability, are the both mean the same? In general, literal sense, are you familiar with these terms, acclimatization and adaptability? In literal sense, don't worry about the content given here. In literal sense, so what is the difference between acclimatization and adaptability? General sense, what is your understanding about it? So anything that you can think of in relationship with, in literal sense, when we say acclimatizing to a new environment or adapting to the new environment, do they mean different things or are they referring to the same thing? Can you differentiate these two terms?
Maybe acclimatization means is specific to climate.
Okay. Okay. So acclimatization in general sense, we use it with respect to the climate. Okay. Acclimatizing to the new climate. Okay. Fine. What about adaptability or
It is
adaptation? They both also mean
mm,
the same. Looks
in
like.
with respect to environment as a whole.
Okay. So we use it in different contexts. One for climate, one for the whole environment. Correct? Okay. So Neil and Preeti, do you want to add something to that?
About acclimatization, I had my friends who went to Siachen Glacier as an expedition. So for a few initial days, they told us that they were not directly taken to the glacier itself. So they had to, uh, they were kept for a week or something in the below areas as a part of acclimatization. And only after that, they were taken to the higher ground. About adaptability, I feel it is the ability of organisms to change to the given environment.
Uh, of an organism. Can you repeat that last sentence?
Uh, for adaptability, I believe that it is the ability of the organism or the living being
Right.
to adapt.
Okay. So yes, good. Actually, good point you actually brought in here because as you rightly said, so we need certain time actually to get used to or adjusted to the new environment. Right. Our body has that plasticity or flexibility to do that. So in a way, you are actually referring to something that is temporary that happens in our body. Like your body is able to adjust to that new environment, but on a temporary basis. You're absolutely right. So acclimatization and adaptability could be our ability to adjust to that new environment, literal sense. Okay, but the concept holds true in the anthropology as well, but with a slightly different connotation to the adaptability component. But otherwise, acclimatization is mostly the short-term adjustment that we normally make. Okay, understand this sentence here. So acclimatization refers to becoming accustomed to a new climate or new conditions. Becoming accustomed to a new climate or new conditions, and usually these are temporary and non-genetic. Temporary changes usually are part of our ability to adjust. Okay, we have little amount of flexibility. We are using that flexibility in acclimatization. So changes are not happening at the DNA level. So they are non-genetic in nature. So acclimatization refers to becoming accustomed to new climate or new conditions, which is non-genetic. And how do we get acclimatized here? By responding physiologically and behaviorally. So physiologically, some changes, like you will notice that maybe you are able to, if you go to the mountain region, you may breathe actually faster, higher amount of breathing rates you notice. So physiological changes that we are making to the body, and it is not necessarily a change that is happening to the DNA. So they are non-genetic in nature. This is physiological or behavioral. Let's say if you're actually experiencing too much of cold, what do? You're starting to shiver. You're starting to shiver, correct? So those type of components are physiological and behavioral components. Okay, such changes are part of acclimatization. Acclimatization. These tend to be temporary. These tend to be temporary. Acclimatization normally involves physiological and behavioral changes to new environments. Example is shivering. Okay. Similarly, if you look into the adaptability in literal sense, it's our ability, as you rightly said, Sunil, it's our ability to get adjusted to the new environment. But here, in the sense of ecological anthropology, adaptations are genetic changes. They are genetic in nature. Okay, so more permanent changes that happen in us. Because let's say you start living in the new environment regularly, what happens? In the new environment, you start noticing that your body is also undergoing changes and to accommodate for the new environment that you are in. So adaptations are these genetic changes that provide a reproductive advantage, meaning those people who have these genetic changes, they are at advantage, they are more fitter than the other people who are living in the same environment. Thereby, they have higher chance of survival rate. That is called adaptability. So acclimatization is temporary, adaptability is a bit more permanent. And for this, changes in the DNA level has to take place or have to take place. Okay, so you can understand it a bit better from this figure I have taken from one biological anthropology book by Stein and Rowe. So where they talk about this is original phenotype. Phenotype is the appearance of us, right? So if there's an original phenotype, there may be a change in the original phenotype, okay, because of the biological plasticity that we have, the flexibility that we have in our body. And this can happen right there in single generation. You don't have to wait for generations for this. So like acclimatization is that. Okay, so what we get is modified phenotype. Modified phenotype. Whereas adaptation requires multiple generations. And here we need to have those changes in our DNA, and natural selection has to select the one that is different. Select the one that is actually advantageous. So what happens here? Genetic variations take place. And what are we noticing here? Differences in fitness within that population we are noticing. Finally results in the modified version of it. Could be temporary modification or a bit more permanent modification. But both of them are dealing with our responses to the environment. Sometimes the word adaptability used slightly differently in different textbooks I have seen. Ember and Ember, they use the word adaptability for genetic changes. But in this book, they gave a slightly different meaning to adaptability. They said developmental changes for adaptable. But don't get confused here. Use the word, I think for this part of the class, acclimatization and adaptation is sufficient to be able to differentiate. Okay. So is the difference clear here between two components? So if you read the ember and ember for the definitions for this, I think I will give you. I'll post these two images, couple of pages that are given in ember related to that. This acclimatization is impermanent physiological changes that we make in the new environment. So they are more temporary changes. Whereas the adaptability is the adaptation is the genetic change that allows the organism to survive and reproduce in a specific environment. They've given this in a chapter called Human Variation, Human Adaptation, Ember and Ember, Anthropology book. So briefly, they talked about the role of mutations that we discussed already in the other class. But if you want, in the perspective of these human adaptations and acclimatization, you can give it a read. Okay, so I'll post this information to you. So humans and the influence of the cultural environment related to that. Okay, so right. So next we'll talk about these changes. I think first I'm going to talk to you in few areas where these what changes happens in us, understand them. Then I'll explain them in the context of culturally what is happening, physiologically what's happening. The first part will focus on the physiological changes, biological changes that happen in us. Okay. So first I will deal with the high altitude stress factors. Then we'll come back to the temperature stress. Adaptations to high altitudes. How do people or humans get adjusted to the high altitude regions? For this, we actually are going to pick up the study done by mainly American anthropologist, American physical anthropologist called Cynthia Bial. American physical anthropologist called Cynthia Bial. So she actually had worked on, she's from Case Western University from US. Okay, she's a physical anthropologist. She did study multiple different populations in the world. And I will also send you a link. This is a National Geography link. National Geography actually funded this research. Okay, where they were trying to understand how different populations living around the world on high altitudes. So three different populations they picked here living in different regions of the world. All of them are living on different mountain regions in the world. And biologically, if they studied this, the scientists have found out that the way they adjusted to the environment has been different biologically. So the explanation I'm going to give you here based on her research and also some of her colleagues' research. So the summary that I made, I'm going to give you. Plus, along with that, so I'm going to give you the link for this discussion that happened in the literature. Okay, right. So what are we talking about here? I think before getting into like what groups they have studied, what actually happens when you go to the high altitude regions? Is it not something that our body can cope up with? So what type of problems do you experience when you go to the high altitude regions? Let's look at that. So when we go to the high altitude regions, the air is much thinner than at the sea level. Thinner, this is a literal word. So thinner in the sense we have less oxygen. So if you go to the high altitude regions, we have less oxygen in the atmosphere. So there is less pressure. So we experience in the atmosphere. So oxygen levels are low compared to the sea level when you are living at the sea level. Compared to that, when you go to the high altitude regions, the oxygen levels drop. So because of that, what happens? Every time we inhale, we get fewer oxygen molecules compared to when we are at the sea level. When you are trying to inhale, the number of oxygen molecules we receive at the sea level and the number of oxygen molecules you receive when you inhale at the high altitude regions is different. You get fewer and fewer molecules as you go up. This is a condition called hypoxia. Use this term, remember this term, hypoxia. Hypo means what? Low. You are familiar with these two terms, right? Hyper, hypo. Hyper means more, hypo means less. Hypoxia means less oxygen. Hypoxia. So fewer oxygen. because we have less oxygen in the atmosphere in the high altitude regions. Okay. So people who went on to live on the high plateaus or high altitude regions, these people are known as highlanders. Highlanders, people who wanted to live in these mountain regions are highlanders. They suffered acute hypoxia. They suffered acute means a quick, immediate, something that is short term. So they experienced acute hypoxia. Because they were receiving fewer and fewer oxygen molecules, so the oxygen supply to the body has decreased. So tissues were not receiving enough oxygen. So what happens? What is the purpose of oxygen? The purpose of oxygen is to generate energy. By using oxygen, we generate energy, correct? So when you have less oxygen, less energy is generated, and the tissues cannot perform their activities as they normally do. So because of this acute hypoxic condition. And how does that show up? When you have less and less oxygen like that, how does that show up? So we start showing up what is called mountain sickness. We start showing up what is called mountain sickness. So headaches, vomiting. People when they climb, when they hike, they may experience headaches, they may vomit, they even experience sleeplessness. Okay, and when you are not receiving enough oxygen, so people start showing this mountain sickness. Symptoms include headaches, vomiting, sleeplessness, and even impaired thinking, because brain also receives less oxygen. So what happens? Impaired, our thinking ability gets impaired. Our ability to think also gets impaired. Okay, and what about our physical activity? Can we perform normal amounts of physical activity in these regions? We won't be. Inability to sustain long periods of physical activity. You won't be able to take up long tasks, especially the physical tasks, to perform this. So you can imagine what happens to the military who actually is serving us in Siachen or those high altitude regions. Right? So they have to be trained specifically for this. So ecological anthropology is not only important for understanding how actually we get adjusted to the new environments, but also to plan such events. Because if you have to fight, if you have to protect our borders, either in the Himalayan region with China that what we are experiencing, or even with Pakistan, because those happen to be in those Himalayan regions where we need people to be trained. And where does this understanding comes from? Our understanding comes from ecological anthropology part. Okay, so we experience mountain sickness in those regions because of the reduced oxygen levels, and our body receives less and less oxygen, resulting in these type of symptoms. But do we die as soon as you go to hike? Some of us experience this type of symptoms. Do we die because of that? If not, how is our body coping up with that type of stress? Okay, for that, as I was mentioning to you, we look into Cynthia Bell's study. Okay, so we notice that in general, with respect to these oxygen levels, a brief idea on that, Cynthia Bell and even other ecological anthropologists and physical anthropologists have noticed that as there is increase in the altitude, we are at the sea level. Our amount of oxygen that we receive is about 160 millimeters of mercury. 160 inspired air or air that we actually receive in. Okay, the partial oxygen levels or PO2 levels it is called, the partial oxygen concentrations that we receive is at the pressure of about 160 millimeters. With 97% of our hemoglobin, which is the carrier of oxygen, is saturated or bound to oxygen. In our body, 97% of the hemoglobin binds to the oxygen. So oxygen saturation levels are usually high. During the COVID-19 time, we are measuring these values, right? PO2 values we are measuring. We are measuring the percentage of oxygen saturation. 97% is what is expected at sea level. But as you go up, let's say if you go to the 10,000 feet or 3,000 meters, what happens? The pressure decreases. 110 millimeters of mercury will become, and only 90% of hemoglobin gets saturated. Then you go up further than that, up to about 15,000 feet or about 4,500 meters, 4.5 kilometers approximately. What happens? The inspired oxygen levels will drop to 98, almost by half they decrease, and our hemoglobin saturation will come down to 80% saturation. And if you go much further and much further, fall that you notice with respect to these two values. Okay, this is where we start seeing initially you may not see too much of a problem, but some people may observe, nighttime vision is affected, nocturnal visual reduction happens, nighttime vision gets affected. But if you go much higher up, then what happens? Drowsiness, headaches, those type of mountain sickness I was studying is starting to appear. And much further, if you go on, what happens? So it gets aggravated. Our central nervous system gets also affected. People may even get seizures and muscles starting to twitch is what normally happens. And finally, if you go about 20,000 feet, so what happens? Unconscious. People become unconscious. Vision will go up, and eventually it may even lead to death. So definitely there is a correlation between reaching the such certain regions like that and decrease in the oxygen levels and the symptoms that we see. Okay, so this is a brief idea about what happens at the high altitude regions to us. But now the question is, how are people living there? If this is the case, even for the temporary duration, if it happens to us, how are people living there? They must be showing some acclimatization and as well as adaptations towards that. What are they? Let's have a look at it. Now we are getting into the responses that humans make. So far we talked about what happens and what changes or what stresses we actually experience at the high altitude regions. Okay, so this is a study done by Cynthia Bell and some of our colleagues where they studied 3 different populations. Okay, they're talking about 3 different populations here. Those that live in Andean mountains, those people that live in Andes mountains or Andean mountains, and those that live in the Ethiopian highland regions. So Andes mountain or Andean mountains are in the South America, correct? I'll show you that in the image. And Ethiopian highlands in Africa, Northeast Africa, and Tibet, that's something we know very well, our Himalayan regions. Those 3 regions that they studied, people living in these regions, I've shown in the images here. Andes, if you see in the image here. So this part, South America, western part of South America is covered by the Andean mountains or Andes. Okay, so this region in South America and Ethiopia. So if you see this portion, so this is Africa, right? So this portion, northern part of the Africa, northeastern part, if you see. Okay, so this portion, Ethiopian region, highland mountain regions here, and our mountain regions, Himalayan regions, these regions, and especially this plateau, Tibetan plateau. These 3 regions, they actually picked up several human subjects and studied them. Okay, so the 3 groups that they studied. So, and people living in Andean mountains, okay, in the western side of the South America, and people living in the Ethiopian highland regions or Ethiopian mountains, which are in the northeastern Africa, northeastern part of Africa, and then Tibetan plateau. So here, so this we know Central Asia and East Asia. So partly in the China region, covering most of the Tibet region and also Qinghai in western China and also part of Ladakh and Jammu and Kashmir part. Okay, so people living in these regions, she and a couple of researchers went there and started studying them. So let's see what did they find out. So they found out that as part of their study, so compared to the people living in the sea level, these other people are also actually maintaining the normal levels of the oxygen in their body. So their body is able to cope up. And when they investigated what changes have happened in biologically or physiologically in them, they found out that Andeans actually use what is called hematological route. understand this and then start making notes on this. So Andeans, so these groups have actually found out that especially two groups in Andeans and Tibetans showed, and also Ethiopians, but they could not have clear understanding about what was happening in Ethiopians. But Andeans, Tibetans, they got an idea of how they adapted to the new environment. And that response seems to be different. The way they adapted to the new environment, they have taken different routes. Andeans have taken hematological route. Hematological means, hematology means blood. So they've taken they made changes to their blood system. How? So they are able to carry more oxygen per unit of blood. For same amount of same volume of the blood, they're able to carry more oxygen. How is that possible? They increase the hemoglobin levels in their blood. So what have they done? They actually increase the hemoglobin levels. The high hemoglobin concentrations are noted down in Andeans. Because of that, they have more red blood cells containing hemoglobin. They're able to deliver more oxygen. Although the oxygen present in the atmosphere is low, but their body got adjusted to that. How? By increasing the amount of hemoglobin. That is why it is called hematological route. Hematological route. So write down as the flow chart and as the key points, because I'm going to provide you a summary on this discussion. Okay. So understanding is very important here. What did I tell you? Cynthia Bell and her colleagues studied people living in different parts of the world, especially on the mountain regions. Here we're talking about three such regions. In first case, Andeans have adopted by increasing their hemoglobin concentrations, by increasing hemoglobin concentrations. So more hemoglobin means more oxygen binding capacity, correct? So that's how they survive in the high altitude regions.
Just the the line here, they have more red blood cells containing hemoglobin. So number of cells are increasing, right?
Yes, I think that's kind of misleading. The sentence, I think they wanted to generalize this, but if you look into the actual paper, the concentration of hemoglobin has increased. The other possibility is also increased red blood cell production. Okay, so I think that what they are saying is comparatively there are more red blood cells containing hemoglobin. I think what they are referring to here is higher hemoglobin concentration in the RBC. More means they're comparing with the people on the sea level. More and more RBCs have higher amount of hemoglobin, they meant. But definitely one possibility that we're going to talk about towards the end is also increasing the red blood RBC concentration. If RBC concentration increases, hemoglobin percentage also increases. Thereby what happens? We also have more ability to carry the oxygen. Okay, high hemoglobin concentrations is what is responsible for carrying this. So the exam also, remember, with these examples, you explain them. So routinely, I think this is one chapter where we get questions as expected. So here, straightforward questions. I think three questions that we can normally hear, like questions where adaptation to the cold environments, cold stress, cold or heat, temperature stress, high altitude stress, and explanation on the adaptability acclimatization concepts. So only these questions come. So if you actually prepare and understand these concepts well, there's a high likeliness that you're going to get one question from this that you can answer in the exam. Okay, right. So this is how they actually gets adapted to the or adapted to the this region, Andeans. So this I picked up from her research paper. So Andean, Tibetan, Ethiopian patterns of adaptation to the high altitude hypoxia. This is published in 2006. So as per this paper, they looked into hemoglobin concentration. So what are we looking at in the graph? As there is increase in the altitude on the x-axis, hemoglobin concentration is increasing in the y, as you see on the y-axis. Our reference point here is low altitude natives, people in the low altitude regions, people living at the sea level, 0 feet or 0 meters height from the sea level. they have hemoglobin concentrations. I think we were talking about hemoglobin concentrations in the last class, right? Or the class before that. So about 15 or 16, around 15 grams per deciliter or deciliter. Correct? This is what we normally notice. But what happens in the highlanders? So if you notice the Andean high altitude populations, or if you notice the Tibetans, if you notice the Ethiopians. So Ethiopians, if you notice, they actually have hemoglobin concentrations falling here, slightly better than what we see on the sea level, about the 16. So their hemoglobin concentrations are not too high. They're in the same range as what we see in the sea level. So hemoglobin concentrations are same. In whom? In Ethiopians. And then if you actually see the Tibetans, so the circles that you notice here, Tibetans, so at the 3000 to 4000 feet, they have slightly higher up concentrations of hemoglobin. If you go up further, so they have also slightly increased levels of the hemoglobins. But what is actually standing out here is this point. This point belongs to Andeans. Andeans at the same 4000 meters height, about 4 kilometers height. Okay, what do you notice here? Compared to the Tibetans actually show about 17.7, 17.8 grams per deciliter hemoglobin, whereas people living in Andean or Andes mountains, they're actually showing about 19.5 to 20 grams per deciliter. So definitely Andeans are showing the higher amounts of hemoglobin concentrations in their blood as compared to even the Tibetans, but of course compared to the Ethiopians and sea level people. So this is a study that what actually made them come to a conclusion that Andeans have taken hematological route here. Are you able to follow this graph? I don't think you need to show it, but this is a simple idea. If you want, you can clearly show this, how three populations have adapted differently. Definitely show sea level here and show an example for the people living in the Tibetan region here and the people living in the Ethiopian first, and then you show the Tibetan, okay, and then you show the Andean. Okay, right. This is a story about the Andeans, but what about Tibetans? So clearly that from the previous graph, we have seen that Tibetans are not showing same amounts of increase in the hemoglobin. But what the scientists have noticed that they probably have taken the respiratory route. So instead of hematological route, I think they're actually preferring the respiratory route. What does it mean? They've actually have changes that happen in the respiratory system, then the transport system. So what does that mean? They're able to increase the oxygen levels. They are able to increase the oxygen levels by taking, more deep breathing. Okay, so collecting more oxygen for every time they inhale and exhale. So every time they inhale specifically, deep breathing that they do here, they take here. So they increase their oxygen levels by breathing more deeply and also by increasing the rate of respiration. So by breathing multiple times per minute, then what we notice at the sea level. So how are they doing it? Tibetans are breathing more deeply. So you can just write they have taken respiratory route or changes happen to the respiratory system or changes are seen with respect to the respiration. How? There's deep more breathly and also more breaths per minute. So rate of respiration has also increased in them. So what's happening here? They're able to take more volume. They're collecting more oxygen every time when they breathe through the deep breathing process. So that's how they're compensating for the less oxygen that is available in the high altitude regions. So this is one method, respiratory method is one. Second change that they have noticed here in them, second adaptation, biological adaptation they have noticed here, they're able to synthesize more nitric oxide. Their lungs are carrying more nitric oxide. So one route is respiratory route. Second is increased amounts of nitric oxide. What is nitric oxide? What does it do? Nitric oxide increases the diameter of the blood vessels. It's like it expands the blood vessels. What does it do? It expands the blood vessels. So when you expand the blood vessel, what happened? You have better circulation. You have improved circulation of oxygen, okay, carrying the blood. So basically, you're increasing the flow of the blood by synthesizing more nitric oxide in the lungs.
Their response, what does their response depend upon?
I didn't understand your question. What do you mean by that? Respond depends on?
Sir, we have seen NDs and Tibetans. So, so their response should have been same for the same altitude, ideally,
Hmm.
but it is different.
No. Actually, they are showing the same outcome, but through different mechanisms. Correct? Andeans. So this is what observation that they have made. Doesn't matter Andeans, Tibetans, Ethiopians, whoever living on the high altitude regions, they have to make certain changes so that they can survive in those regions. Correct? So what are we learning here? What changes have they made is what we are looking into here. So in the previous case, people who are living Andeans, people living in the Andes mountains, they have actually survived or surviving in those regions by making changes to the blood, especially through the increase in hemoglobin levels. But whereas here, so they also are able to adjust in that environment, but not in the same route, not using the same mechanism. Here they're able to breathe more faster, more deeper. They're able to carry more oxygen, which has become a normal for them, because these are the signs we normally hear as what happens in the acclimatization process. But I think certain biological changes, adaptations have happened in them. I'm going to show you one such example here, where they collect more oxygen by deep breathing. So compared to other people, it became common to them that they actually make their respiratory rate is normally high on the higher end compared to us. Second, they also make certain chemicals called nitric oxide, which increases their diameter of the blood vessels. So they pump more blood. So think the way they adapted is different between the Andeans and Tibetans. The outcome is same in a way. In both the ways, they're able to adjust to that new environment. Okay, so what are we learning here? The mechanism is different, but the outcome is same. Correct? I don't know if that answered your question. I didn't exactly understand your question, but did it answer your question?
Basically, yeah, you answered it. But basically, my question was that why is there a difference? So
We don't know. That's a good question. Why is there a difference? It's like this. It's like, you want to go from Mumbai to Delhi, for example, or Hyderabad to Delhi. So people might take different routes, correct? So here they have taken different routes to reach the same destination. Why? I think in natural selection as well, it depends on what variety you have in the given population. It's not like you have the best plan. You know your destination. How you get there may differ based on what resources you have and what guidance or what raw material you have at that point of time. That could be the thing. So that's why natural selection doesn't have a directionality. It knows what is more beneficial. So both of them benefit is to survive, and whatever changes have happened in them, they got selected by natural selection. So we don't have to have the same mechanism for that. That is clearly what it has shown here. Okay, so and also one point I want you to make a note of, if you can write in the exam, this is value addition in the exam if you want to write, because we talk about genetic adaptations, but what genetic changes have happened, I think not much information is known on that. The only information I found here a little bit on the genetic changes that happen, because first part of the syllabus actually in the chapter talks about genetic and non-genetic factors, correct? So one example I've seen here with respect to genetic factors is, so one lady, she studied Tibetans, they noticed that there is a high survival rate for offsprings who are born to the Tibetan women. So Tibetan women, when they had children, people who have certain genetic changes that make them survive better, or that make them in specific have high oxygen levels in their body. So they have certain genetic changes. Those kids have survived. Those kids that don't have this genetic change, they died. So children tend to breathe faster, right? And some children could not cope up when they are born in the high altitude regions. Why? Because they probably don't have those genetic changes in them. And the kids who had those genetic changes, which made them to carry more oxygen, they survived. Meaning this is an advantage, survival of the fittest example here. So certain genetic changes have happened in them. And children with those genetic changes or with those mutations in them survived better over the other children who didn't have them. And they mentioned what are those genes. I'm going to point out, just make a note of this word first. Okay, higher survival rate for offsprings of Tibetan women. So those children who survived here are children with high oxygen saturation genotypes. High oxygen saturation genotypes. Okay. So ecological anthropology by Allen and Stanford talks about this concept. So she's the one I was talking about. Another lady, her name is Andrea Willi. She's an anthropologist who studied the people living in the Ladakh region. Okay, Andrea Willi, she's investigating those effects. And she found out that, so also Cynthia Bial was focusing on the other groups. So she was the one I was talking about. Hemoglobin concentrations are increasing at high altitudes. Yeah, so this is the one I want to point out. Tibetans are notably resistant to developing chronic mountain sickness. And also, they don't create or overproduce red blood cells and high hemoglobin levels. So they're not responding the same way that I was talking to you about with respect to the Andean people. Okay, the Andean people study comes from Cynthia Bell. And here, so how are they doing it? Bial and her colleagues have identified what is called EPAS1 gene. Genetic changes to a gene called EPAS1. So genetic changes examples we are learning here, EPAS1. So Tibetan populations are showing mutations in the EPAS1. So the variations in EPAS1, this EPAS1 seems to be responsible for or connected to RBC production. RBC production. Okay, so some genetic changes are noticed like this in them. Okay.
But sir, did we say that Tibetan had taken the respiratory route?
Yes, they have taken the respiratory route, yes, but some genetic changes are happening. So we're not talking about here. I think what you're confusing here is that the hematological changes, gene responsible for hematological changes is what is noticed, correct? I think looks like here it is not supporting the concept of changes happen to the blood, but it didn't make the changes to happen. So as I was mentioning to you, red blood cells or hemoglobin concentrations have not increased in them, correct? So they're not taken the hematological route, but they carry some genetic changes to a gene associated with the red blood cell production. Maybe it is able to manage, it is actually didn't allow the change in the RBC production. Okay, so variation is supporting the concept where this hematological route has not taken. Okay, and they could point out what gene was responsible for this. One of the genes, there may be several genes and one of the genes that they could show here as responsible for that. Okay, they're not suggesting that they have taken hematological route. They are suggesting that there are genes called EPAS1 gene, which is of course something to do with the red blood cell production, has underwent mutation. So, and they have not shown hematological change yet. They have shown respiratory change. Okay, but this is one example of gene that I have found in the literature that they talked about. Okay. So in this particular chapter, they went further on discussing about when was this EPAS1 gene for the first time has been seen, which is not relevant to the topic that we are discussing here, but they talk about in the archaeological perspective and evolutionary perspective that this gene was actually first time seen not in the modern human, another human ancestors. And looks like this interestingly, this was carried by people living in Tibet. So some amount of admixture or crossing might have happened at some point of time. Correct. That is not the part of the discussion that we are focusing on this part. Okay. So it's simply I wanted to add a genetic component here, an example for the genetic component. Right. So this is about Andeans and Tibetans. What about the Ethiopians? Could they find out what route that Ethiopians have taken here? So unlike the Tibetans and Ethiopians, as per this literature, so Tibetans and Ethiopian highlanders who are living in 3,530 meters, they neither breathe rapidly, so they have not taken respiratory route, they don't breathe rapidly, than people living in sea level, nor do they have ability to more effectively synthesize nitric oxide. So they cannot make more nitric oxide, they cannot rapidly breathe. And also, unlike the Andeans, they don't have high hemoglobin concentrations. Then how do they survive? So this is still a mystery. They have not found out. Is there a third mechanism in them? But the two mechanisms that they have studied in the Andeans and the Tibetans is not holding true for Ethiopians. So they don't have answer for Ethiopians. What mechanism is working in them? So the answer still is a mystery that Cynthia Biol and others are working on at the moment. But these changes have not happened in them. So at least they're able to tell that the respiratory route and the hematological route has not taken. There must be something else. Okay, like that, the three groups might have taken different routes to get adjusted to it, but Tibetans and Andeans mechanism is known. But for Ethiopians, I think we still have to work on it, and research still has not figured out the mechanism behind their adaptations.
We should be doing gene map of these people actually.
Yes, but a gene map would only tell us where certain genes are. How do you know the function of them?
Any difference? I mean, actually, any difference with us would tell us.
Yes. So differences, I think nowadays because of genome sequencing studies, exactly, it's a great tool that this tool can help us reveal some of those missing links. Okay, but the thing is there may be more complex things happening in the body. It won't be simple on a missing component. I think further research has to be done. But mostly in the textbooks that they talk about, I think every time you search for it, Cynthia Bell is the one who stands out in terms of our research, and our papers, latest papers, last few years ago, have not told anything new about this. Okay, but definitely I think genome sequencing tool is going to help us a bit on this side. You're absolutely right. So that is a great application of genome sequencing tools. Okay. You will skip this one. Yeah, this is simply showing that what we just talked about. Okay, explanation is given. So she was showing that hemoglobin levels were not any different in many of them. Like Tibet, so this is so Tibet region, Andean region. Okay, where hemoglobin levels are high. Otherwise, hemoglobin levels are more or less normal in other regions. Sea level, Ethiopia, Tibet, hemoglobin levels are more or less same. and also increased red blood cell count, also high in them. That is not the case with the other two that we have just noticed, I just talked about. Okay. So, but in general, what have we learned here? So in general, if you have to write, we have talked about the examples. In general, what have we learned here? So we make various physiological adjustments, okay, to our body in order to reduce the stress caused by hypoxic condition or low oxygen level conditions, especially in people who permanently live there. You can go for hiking. We guys actually have that flexibility, temporary adjustments. We probably need more breather. Sorry, we actually breathe more deeper, and with increasing the respiratory rate, we can also do without having permanent changes to the DNA or to our physiological systems. That is temporary, right? But these people who are permanently living there also have that ability through the genetic changes. And they have a great increase in their pulmonary ventilation. Their breathing rate has greatly increased. Breathing rate or ventilation process where they're able to take in enough oxygen has changed. And increased diffusion capacity is also changed. So one aspect of this is able to breathe enough oxygen. Second is the oxygen that entered into the lungs has to enter into the transport system, enter into the blood. That is a diffusion process. Diffusion is where oxygen moves from the lungs to the blood. So there is also increased diffusion capacity of the lungs. These people might also show increased diffusion capacity. So more amounts of oxygen can easily diffuse from lungs to the blood in them. So greater pulmonary ventilation or breathing rates, and increased diffusion rates. And third, increased ability of the tissues to use oxygen. Also, the cells get better at utilizing oxygen compared to the people living in the sea level. So the different levels, I think changes have to happen. These are the acclimatization that happen. So this can happen without genetic changes. Pulmonary ventilation, diffusion capacity, and tissues learning to utilize oxygen better, and then vital capacity, increased vital capacity. So what is vital capacity? So vital capacity is nothing but the maximum amount of air one can take from the lungs after maximum inhalation. The maximum amount of air a person can expel from the lungs after maximum inhalation. When you inhale completely, the amount of volume of the air that you actually expel is called vital capacity. So we also notice the difference in the vital capacity. Okay. So in general, these are the changes that we talked about, but in specific, we talked about the hematological route and respiratory route, and also the chemical synthesis as a specific examples under few case studies, particularly the case studies on those groups of people. Okay, also we talked about this hyperventilation we talked about. Okay, so hyperventilation. So something that specifically happens to people at high altitudes is we can actually have more chemical receptors are made. When we have less and less oxygen percentage is seen, less oxygen percentage is seen. So what happens in people, they can produce some extra chemical receptors, which facilitate the process of this deep breathing. Okay, the deep breathing happens and oxygen enters, there must be new receptors, special receptors that can carry oxygen further. So that is called hyperventilation process can be seen. So these are the other mechanisms that are possible. So hyperventilation. Okay, stimulating or production of or synthesis of chemical receptors to increase the rate and depth of breathing. And then tachycardia, I think I used this term yesterday, right? In yesterday's class, pulse rate. I think we talked about tachycardia and bradycardia. So what is tachycardia? Increased cardiac output. So increased heart rate, heartbeat increases in tachycardia. So we are pumping more blood. With more blood as it is going, it is carrying more oxygen. Correct? So that is another method, tachycardia. You can also mention that in response to this, to high altitude stress, we show tachycardia, we show hyperventilation. Okay. So increased concentration of what is called 2,3-DPG. 2,3-DPG, it's a chemical. Before we talked about nitric oxide, right? Similarly, our body can make more 2,3-DPG. 2,3-DPG stands for 2,3-biphosphoglycerate. 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 DPG means di, di means both means same. Two, they're referring to two. BPG or DPG. So biphosphoglycerate, what happens? So in few hours, as part of acclimatization, when we get to the high altitude regions, when we experience less amount of hemoglobin concentrations, or sorry, less amount of oxygens, what happens? We produce this chemical. What does this chemical do? This chemical changes the hemoglobin ability to bind oxygen. What does this chemical do? So this allows the hemoglobin to release oxygen better and faster. So this chemical regulates the amount of oxygen that is being released by the hemoglobin. The amount of oxygen being released by the hemoglobin. So such chemical changes happen in our body in response to high altitude stress. So hyperventilation, more chemical receptors for deeper breathing and increasing the rate of breathing. And tachycardia, increased pumping of blood and increased 2,3-DPG or BPG by phosphoglycerates. This is to release oxygens better, unloading the oxygen by hemoglobin better. So look at how many different aspects our body can actually deal in response to the high altitude stress. Similarly, we'll notice some of these components in our responses to temperature as well. More capillaries open up in tissues than at the sea level. Okay, more blood capillaries open up or pump the blood for increasing supply of oxygen. Okay, usually they say that some of the capillaries are at reserve. They're reserved for such supplies. So many capillaries actually open up. So increasing vascularity of the tissues. So this is a common theme that we notice in the response to temperature. Okay, so in more capillaries open up, and next point is more angiogenesis, or you're creating new capillaries, new circulatory capillaries. We are adding new blood vessels in a way. So this is the common process that you see in cancers. Angiogenesis, or creation of new blood vessels. New circulatory capillaries are created. Okay, so these are some changes that we normally notice. We'll discuss more on vasodilation part later. Okay, but in the temperature stress, but make a note of these things. I want you to have these ideas, how we respond to the high altitude stress, and also add these examples that we talked related to the studies on Andeans and also studies on the Tibetans and Ethiopians. Okay, but this is mostly physiological and biological roots. So we talked about some genetic and non-genetic changes here. And we also talked about some of the genes that are responsible for this. And I briefly talked about these Tibetans and Indians and how do they respond to it. Okay, is there anything known about how they culturally responded to it? What about the cultural aspect of this? I was looking for some clues on what might have happened culturally in the process of high altitude region, adaptations in people. For that, I found one article that I was reading on this. I'll give you a couple of points for you to write down on this. Okay, so this is an article published in 2016. Okay, so this is called The Cultural Context of Biological Adaptation to High Elevation Tibet, published in Archaeological Research in Asia, a 2016 paper. So some clues can be identified here. I don't think there are any clear outcomes here as well, but good ideas are given here. Let me, I highlighted a few points here that you can make a note of. So here they talked about how early human activity on Tibetan plateau, Tibetan origin, when did people starting to go to the Tibetan regions like that. They talked about those background information here. And a few things that they have seen in terms of how people got adjusted to it. Culturally, what type of cultural adaptations they went to. So whenever people move to new places, I think one thing is that to survive, they need food. Correct? So what type of changes they have made, what type of foods actually they started eating or growing, what type of changes have happened to the agriculture. So they say that in late Neolithic farmers living along the eastern margins of the Tibetan plateau, so those people might have had issue with the growing certain crops. Like for example, they said that initially there were indications that they were growing millets. They were trying to grow millets in those regions. Okay, but the problem is millets don't give proper yields with elevation. So millets, there is enough variability, enough annual variability can be seen in millets with increasing elevation. So they probably didn't have too much of success with respect to growing millets in those regions. So what they might have done, they probably started domesticating to barley. And the barley is less susceptibility to this low and high temperature, low and freezing temperatures. Because in the high altitude regions, you experience low temperatures, right? So in those temperatures and things like barley would provide better yields. Okay, so they might have adapted to the culturing of or growing barley-like components. They might have attempted to try growing millets, but they probably had some issue there. They might have adapted to these type of things, specifically barley, which is less susceptible to that low temperatures. Okay, so like that shifting to cultivation practices towards the less sensitive crops probably seen as a cultural aspect of it. Cultural adaptation here is the growing crops that are less susceptible to the temperatures or climate in the high altitude regions. Make a note of this. Write this point down. So cultural adaptations here could be shifting to the crops, shifting to the crops like barley, that are less sensitive to the variations in that are less sensitive to the variations in high altitude regions. Variations in high altitude regions. Here, most likely the temperature aspect. So low temperatures are commonly seen. Some crops are not good for those low temperatures. Okay, this is one point. Second point, so as these authors in this particular case, they see the pattern of risk reduction where specifically growing or adapting to the growth of sheep and even cattle. Animal domestication. So the patterns of animal domestication, growing sheep and even perhaps cattle. So what is the benefit of that? So here, they probably would have added the abundance of fuel. They could have got enough dung as a fuel source, where these high altitude regions probably are poor in fuel. So those regions, they could actually generate by adapting to the domesticating the sheep and other cattle, they could get enough dung. So studies are showing that in northeastern part of the Tibetan region, there are indications of domestication of these animals, especially in the 2,500 meters and above when people were living. So there was indications of growing sheep and cattle. So basically what they did here, fine tuning of the production related to the local environment, and especially when there is a shortage of something like the millets were not available. So relying on something like barley, which can grow better there. So this is their fine tuning to the new environment, and using sheep to convert otherwise inedible high elevation vegetation into calories people could eat. Okay, also converting or utilizing the natural resources that they have there, where sheep could actually digest or utilize it. And growing barley and wheat in place of millets. Okay, so through these steps, so these new agricultural products helped the people to live in an environment which they were not otherwise adjusted to. So this might have happened in there. Plus, they also talk about they've adapted to better ways of food storage because of the shortage of foods in the given regions, because they could not grow certain crops like millets. So through the culture, plant and animal domestication, food storage, they also worked on food storage processes for having enough food to support their living there. In the same process, they were adapting physiologically. I was telling you, physiologically, their body was coping up with this. So, in the meantime, the cultural practices also have greatly helped them to survive in the high altitude regions. Okay, right. So, these are some ideas about what type of cultural adaptations that people might have made in the high altitude regions. So, we talked about physiological, biological, and cultural adaptations, and what is the scenario with respect to the high altitude regions. Okay, right. Next, we'll talk about the adjustments to the temperature stress, cold and heat stress. Cold and heat stress. So you notice more or less an opposite phenomena, because although we have two stress factors here, in a way we actually notice opposite phenomena for our responses to cold and heat. Okay, so let me briefly explain you that. Adaptation. Next, we're talking about adaptations to hot and cold stresses. So what happens to our body when it is exposed to too much of a temperature? We are called cold-blooded or warm-blooded animals. How are we called? Cold or warm?
Warm.
Warm. Question mark?
Warm.
Warm. Okay. Preeti?
Warm-blooded.
Warm-blooded. What is the difference between cold-blooded and warm-blooded animal? In literal sense, cold-blooded, those that eat animals, right? And those that can kill. But what does it mean in the sense of science? So cold-blooded animals, they cannot maintain their body temperature. Their body temperature is in sync with the environment. Whereas warm-blooded animals, doesn't matter where we live, we maintain our body temperature constantly. So our body temperature is maintained approximately 36.9 degrees centigrade. Doesn't matter if you go to Himalayan region like Siachen region, or if you go to Africa, your body temperature has to be maintained approximately 36.9. How do we maintain it? Through our physiological processes. By actually showing varied amounts of responses, our body temperature is normally maintained. So normal range is usually normally we maintain about 36.9. Okay, when temperature falls down below that, you start experiencing what is called cold stress. We start experiencing cold stress. It can be called as hypothermia. Like we talked about as hypoxia, here it is called hypothermia. Hypothermia. Okay. So what we notice is cold stress. Cold stress can also be very, very dangerous. Okay, as it drops down below 36.5 and goes to 32, it becomes severe hypothermia and very, very dangerous to us. What happens normally when temperature drops down below what our body can maintain? What happens in hypothermia, hypothermic conditions? So especially when you see people living Arctic region or polar regions, okay, so they experience a lot of problems, especially they have a cold attack. So what happens if you're normally in the cold regions? What happens in the winters for us? What is a common symptom that you notice in the winters? I'm not sure what
Shivering.
parts of the India you live in. Colder regions, what normally happens?
Shivering.
Shiva, okay, right. Good. That is a response. That's a very good response, physiological response to the cold. But the common problem that we notice is dryness. Correct? Our skin gets very dry. Most of us actually apply moisturizers in the winters. Why? Because low humidity. We experience low humidity, which desiccates the skin, which dries out the skin, desiccates the skin. Thereby, we start having too much of dryness, itchiness, flakiness on the skin. Okay. So cold attack, we normally notice when temperature drops, not necessarily to the hypothermial conditions, but just enough where we notice the humidity decreases here, desiccating the skin, making the skin dry and showing that itchiness and flakes of the skin. Okay. And also if temperature goes much below than that, what we experience is frostbite. Have you noticed if you leave your, like if you put your hands, I'm not sure if you have seen any programs like this in Discovery or National Geography, people who actually perform research in the polar regions, what happens to them? Those are people who actually happen to die in those regions, avalanches, for example. Their body actually bulges out. So blood gets frozen. The blood gets frozen and the body is starting to bulge out. And they die from the frostbite. Okay. So what happens here? Our blood vessels starting to contract. This is a normal response to the temperature, low temperatures. Blood vessels tend to contact and we lose oxygen supply because blood supply is not happening enough because our body tries not to lose enough heat. So it reduces the blood flow and reduction in blood flow happens. When reduction in blood flow takes place, we don't receive enough oxygen and cells starting to die, tissues starting to die eventually. So what happens here? Frostbite, what do we notice? We start seeing the blood supply being slowed down. Our blood supply slows down. So that results in less oxygen supply to the body. Then if no oxygen supply, cells and tissues starting to die off. And the more sensitive regions in our body include these that are highlighted. You start feeling that on the nose. If you have gone to the cold regions, you can feel that in the nose. Your nose becomes cooler. Nose, ears also. You can feel that in the ears also. They feel more cooler in the around than the other part of the body. So nose, ears, our toes, fingers. You're starting to feel your fingers. Correct? So that's because your frostbite they have higher sensitivity to the frostbite. But eventually, if temperature goes down below than that, what happens? We die. So our body would give up. So this is life-threatening. We also see muscle twitching that happens in people and they die. Eventually, when they're exposed to too much of colder temperatures. Okay? So this hypothermia can kill us, and hypothermia can cause the simple concept of dryness to the frostbites to the death in humans. Okay, so but how do we defend it? How do we respond to it? How do we respond to such cold stress? How do we respond to hypothermia? This image nicely summarizes various points related to that. Okay, so as I was telling you, when hypothermia sets in, a body focuses on protecting our vital organs. I was telling you, average body temperature is about 36.9 or 37. 35 degrees, 34 degrees mild, and we notice that it can go down to moderate and severe hypothermic condition. I was already telling you, in the mild conditions, I think Preeti was mentioning that we shiver. We're starting to shiver. One response that we notice is shivering. So what happens during the shivering process? Shivering is the body defense mechanism to the cold stress. Shivering is the body's defense mechanism to cold stress. What happens here? Muscles starting to contract. In shivering, muscles starting to contract increases oxygen consumption and blood acidity. So what do? Muscles starting to contract, increasing the oxygen consumption and increasing the blood acidic nature, pH value of the blood. Okay, in shivering, this is what normally happens, our muscles starting to contract. That is why in response to cold, what happens to our hair? Hair stands up. This is called piloerection. This is called piloerection. P-I-L-O erection. E-R-E-C-T-I-O-N. Piloerection. Why? Again, muscles underneath them actually contract. Then what happens to the hair? Hair stands up. So this type of phenomena that we see as in response to the cold. Okay. So because of the muscle contraction that happens here. So shivering is one such thing. And the next most important thing here, I think very, very important thing is vasoconstriction. Have you heard about vasoconstriction? Make a note of this, vasoconstriction. Vasoconstriction. So it refers to contraction in blood vessels. Contraction in blood vessels. Refers to contraction in blood vessels. Contraction blood vessels. This is a common theme. Have you ever noticed that? Have you ever tried to hold something that is cold or in the winters? What happens to your body? As opposed to, let's say you put your hand onto something that is too hot or too warm. Let's say you are around the fire, for example. What color does your body turns into, your face or your hands? Let's say you are standing in the hot sun. What color does it turn into? You're exposed to hot sun. What color will your body show?
Red.
Red. Okay. What about when you're exposed to cooler temperatures? What color does your body show?
Blue.
What color?
Blue.
Blue. Okay, may not be too visible sometimes, yet it may become bluish or pale. It will become pale. So what is the difference? The redness is because of more increased blood flow. More blood is coming to the periphery of the body, external parts of the body when you're exposed to heat. Opposite is true with the cold climates. So what happens here? Less and less blood flow happens to the external part of the body. The key parts of the body, the key parts, internal organs in your body receive blood because we cannot compromise on that. But the external parts of the body, blood supply decreases. Why? Because blood is a mechanism. Blood is one way of releasing heat to the external environment. So if you increase the blood supply, we lose more heat to the external parts of the body. That is what happens in the hot conditions. That is called vasodilation. We'll talk about it in the next part, heat stress. So here we're talking about cold stress where the blood supply to the peripheral parts of the body decreases. This is what is called vasoconstriction. Blood vessels contract, especially blood vessels to the outer side of the body. Blood supply decreases. That is why we look pale or we look blue. Why is that? Because when you decrease the blood supply, less heat is lost. So you're not allowing the heat to get lost from the body. You are maintaining you are preserving the body heat under cold temperatures. And blood mostly gets redistributed to the vital organs. Vital organs keep receiving the blood. But the external parts of the body, peripheral parts of the body will not receive enough blood. This is to conserve the heat produced in the body. That process is called vasoconstriction. Very common phenomena that we see. Is it clear? Are you able to follow this? Okay, right. So for this to happen, hypothalamus, the brain region, hypothalamus region, which is responsible for regulating temperature. The region in the brain called hypothalamus, which regulates the body temperature. So this part of the brain is also affected here. What does it do? It tries to maintain the temperature of the body. And it helps in controlling the blood supply, as I was telling you, as part of the vasoconstriction. Okay, and also brain starting to receive less blood, relatively less blood, but vital organs receive enough blood, but activity will be less. The cold climates, we tend to notice that activity is less. Okay, generally, our body performance ability decreases in the cold climates. But of course, in the physical way, if you work more, if you are more active, if you do exercise, what happens? Your body releases heat. Okay, so physiological processes can be affected from physical work as well. Okay, what else? So vasoconstriction is very important. Muscle movements like shivering is very important. And also the way that brain responds is also important. In addition to that, even heart responds to such conditions. Through tachycardia, we just talked about tachycardia, rise in heart rate and blood pressure. So heart is also affected in the process. People may experience tachycardia or bradycardia. Tachycardia is where heart rate increases, bradycardia where heart rate decreases. Which is more suitable for the cold conditions in response? Tachycardia or bradycardia?
Tachycardia.
Why tachycardia? Tachycardia will increase the blood supply, right? So basically, we want less blood supply to go out so that less heat is lost. But otherwise, the normal blood supply has to be maintained for the vital organs, as we talked about. Okay, so the key points that we talked about here is this vasoconstriction. So focus on the cold one. I'll come back to this. Vasoconstriction. Okay, and shivering. So rapid contraction and relaxation of the skeletal muscles. And the piloerection, hairs on the skin standing up. And another immediate behavioral change that we see is curling up. What happens how do you sleep normally in the cold climates? You tend to curl up. when you actually come together, you don't let the body to lose heat. Correct? That is a normal physical response or behavioral response to the cold, curling up. Okay, vasoconstriction, shivering, piloerection, and curling up are the key components that we see, and some aspects of the functioning of the body also is changed here. So there is a rule related to that. Okay, in with respect to how we adapt to these changes, there's something called Bergman rule. Something called Bergman rule. So what is Bergman rule? So Bergman rule is given by a German biologist called Carl Bergman. So let's see what did he suggest about the Bergman rule. How is it related to the temperature climates like this with change in normal temperatures? 1847, this German biologist Carl Bergman, what did he observe? That within the same species of warm-blooded animals, what he noticed that within the same species of warm-blooded animals, populations having less massive individuals are more often found in warm climates near the equator. So what is he saying? People who are more thin and lean are found in the warm climates. So he's correlating the body size and the places or the areas where regions where they live. So he's saying people who are actually less massive, thin people. So body shape also is adjusted to the weather. So thin people, an average, of course, there's enough range. Obesity we talked about in the last class, right? The people do have variation in that, but in general, we notice that less massive people being found in the warm climates near the equator, while those who are bulk, who are stout and bulk with more mass are found near the colder regions or towards the poles. So if you move away from the equator to the colder regions, you start noticing that the stockiness of people, bulkness of the people increases. Is that true? Do you agree with that? This is what we normally notice. Look at these two people. People living in Africa, they tend to be slender. And what are we looking at on the right? Who are these people? What kind of people are you looking at here on the right? Inuit populations. People live near the polar regions. They tend to be stocky. They tend to be bulky compared to people living in the warm climates. What difference does it make? So does body size has anything to do with this? Yes,
Maybe they have more fat.
more fat. Okay.
That's why it acts as an insulation.
Okay, good point. Preeti?
So I was also saying the same point.
Fat. Okay, good. Yes, it's something. It has something to do with the fat content of the body. Fat has a function of preserving heat, and also fat is a way that we produce our metabolic reactions. Through our metabolic reactions by burning fat, for example, we generate heat inside our body, irrespective of the external environment, external temperature. Inside our body, we can burn fat, thereby producing heat. Thereby producing heat. Okay, so this is what normally happens inside our body. So if you have more fat content, we are able to burn it and thereby generating enough heat that required for maintaining the normal body temperature. Okay, that is what I've explained here. So this is due to the fact that big animals generally have larger body masses, which result in more heat being produced. People who are stocky tend to have larger body mass, tend to have higher amount of fat percentage. They can produce more heat. And second point that I wanted to make a note of here, one, their size, body size, larger body sizes, they can produce more heat. One. Second point, they usually have smaller surface area. Compared to the body weight, the body exposed to the external environment is less. They are more stocky, they're more short, and they have more body weight. Correct? So area, outer area, external area, or surface area is relatively small. So I just spoke to you that blood supply, when happens to the periphery, we lose heat. There is less amount of surface area. There is less chance for losing heat if they have less surface area. Second point I want you to note down here, they have smaller surface area relative to their body mass. Therefore, the amount of heat that they release is also small, or the amount of heat they lose is also small. Okay, so they have smaller surface area related in relationship with their body mass. So therefore, the loss of heat is also less. So if you cannot connect very well with Inuit populations, think of polar bears. Polar bears. They have very large but compact bodies, correct? Huge bodies but compact. They're not as big as whales or elephants. They're compact but heavy. They have relatively small surface areas from which they can lose, their internal produced heat. So less amount of heat gets lost because of less surface area. So this seems to be one way that we adapt to the cold climates. Okay, and is that really hold true? Do Bergmans and rule? First, we'll talk about Bergmans rule. Does it really hold true for humans? So, as per this, the studies that they have done, study of 100 human populations in early 1950s have showed that strong negative correlation between body mass and mean annual temperature of the region, meaning inverse correlation. As as the temperature, outside temperature decreases, body size increases. So that seems to be the case. Okay, so definitely, I think Bergman rule to a certain extent holds true even today. The next one that is interesting here is Allen's rule. We are going to talk about what is called Allen's rule. So, what is Allen's rule? So, Allen is an American biologist. Joel Allen is an American biologist. In 1877, he went further than Bergman in observing specific parts of the body, and he started finding correlation between the length of the body parts and the climate. He's observed that the length of the arms, legs, and other appendages also has an effect on the amount of heat lost to the surrounding environment. So he said there is a correlation between the length of the parts of the body, arms, legs, and other parts of the body, and to our environment. He noted that among warm-blooded animals, individuals in populations of the same species living in warm climates near the equator, so people living in the warm climates tend to have longer limbs. So people living in the warm climates tend to have longer limbs compared to the people living in the cold environments. That in a way more or less holds true, right? We have seen Africans having more longer, legs, for example, arms, for example, compared to the Inuits. But in a way, this is more or less talks about what we already discussed. The body is relatively long parts, long appendages. What happens? It will be less compact and subsequently has more surface area. Correct? Those people who are less stocky, they have long bodies, lengthy bodies, and more surface area, less fat, less stock. So they lose more heat easily, right? That is how their body is designed. So that is what actually he talked about this mostly with respect to the animals like this. So appendages are shorter in colder climates and longer in warmer climates. So animals that live in the colder climates tend to have smaller appendages compared to the animals that live in the warmer climates. Ears, tails, some parts of the body like legs, they tend to be longer. Ear length, hares longer and rabbits shorter. Okay, but this is true for some groups, but not for every other animal. So you cannot generalize this phenomena, but some examples would hold true for Allen's rule. This is also kind of true with humans as well, to some extent. In humans, members of Maasai tribe of East Africa, if you observe Maasai tribe of East Africa, they normally tend to be tall and have slender bodies. They are tall and have slender bodies with long limbs. So because of that, they have more surface area, they can lose heat easily, right? So this is an optimal body shape in the hot tropical parts of the world. But same thing is not true for cold climates. So stocky body with short appendages would be more efficient in maintaining body heat. Okay, for the same reason that we talked about. So Allen's rule and Bergman's rule more or less are related as you see it. Bergman mostly talked about the overall size of the body, and Allen talked about the appendages. Okay, cannot be completely generalized, but for sure holds true to a certain extent. Okay, so these are two relevant rules they normally talk about in the text. There is one more that may be relevant to us is the nose shape or nose size. Have you noticed any difference in the nose size in people living in the colder environments and the warmer environments? May not hold completely true, but to a certain extent. So people living in the cold climates, do they have long noses or short noses? Cold climates.
Short.
Short.
Okay, people who are living in the cold climates, we cannot generalize. That is what I was telling you. They tend to have long noses. Long noses to be adaptive in arid areas and cold environments. This may fall under what is called Thomson's nose rule, association between nose form and temperature. So what is the link here? What is the connection between temperature or climate and the nose shape? What happens if you have longer nose than the bulky nose?
Air has
Yes,
more time.
yes, they have more time,
More oxygen.
more oxygen.
More time to make it warm, and then you can easily go into it.
Exactly. So what happens if you have longer noses? Imagine what happens when you breathe in the cold air. Before it gets into the lungs, if it gets warmed up a bit, it will be easier for the body. Otherwise, body will feel the shock. So if you have longer and thin noses, what happens? There will be enough time for it to become warm. So your body can add some warmth to it. Okay, so long noses, but of course we cannot generalize because especially these days people do travel everywhere. If you keep genetic pool as it is, they may keep having long noses. But you see, since olden days people started traveling, right? They had wars on different countries. They started migrating to different areas. So this feature probably doesn't hold true very much. Otherwise, all of us should have, or all of us or Africans should have more bigger noses, and most of the people in polar area should have long noses. But that's not the case. Correct, but looks like there is some correlation here that long noses can make air a bit more warmer. So they have a benefit here of having long noses compared to the broad noses. Okay. Right. So anything else? These are the rules that I wanted to briefly mention here. I'll quickly talk to you about adaptations that you're already familiar about, and I'll stop the class there. So Inuit people, for example, what type of cultural adaptations you see in them? So far we talked about physiological and biological features. Some cultural adaptations I want to cite here. One, I told you they have short and stout bodies, the biological features. Cultural adaptations include their clothing. So they use animal fur, for example, correct, for clothing, and also hair, something that contains enough hair. So covered by hair and also fur. Fur and the animal skin is routinely used. So this is cultural adaptation. domestication and using those clothing that is suitable for preserving the heat or conserving the heat in their body. Inuit wear clothes like this. And also housing. Housing, especially, I don't think I've taken here, but igloos is a good example. Inuit people live in igloos, or some of them. Nowadays, I think modern days slightly different. But people in the polar regions, if you go to the regions near Sweden or Canada, to Alaska, those regions, you do find people living in the igloos. Why do they actually live in igloos? What is the benefit of building houses with ice? What property of the ice is important here? So why do they build houses with ice? No idea? Property of ice, physics or physical property of ice. Is ice is a good conductor or insulator? Does ice conduct heat well? Or is it a bad conductor?
Insulate, right?
Insulator. Have you heard this example that you probably study for competitive exams? When the temperature falls below zero, the top layer of the lake normally freezes, okay? And ice, because of the density of the ice, which is low, it floats up. So what happens normally? That ice acts like an insulator. And the bottom layer of this lake doesn't freeze. That is why fish can survive in the water like that. So the top portion usually contains ice. Ice is an insulator. So if you build igloos, so you will not have the experience of the temperature, that heat. They normally say that. I remember when I was in Canada, I had a student who I was teaching. He belongs to the community of native Indians. Okay, and he was explaining me one day that he was sent for a particular competition. The competition was like this: that he used to climb the mountains, and they only give certain tools to them. You probably see this type of tasks in the shows on Discovery and National Geography. So they were given certain tools. What they have to do? They have to dig in the ice and build something like an igloo, and they put some warm candle in the entrance. So what happens? It actually blows the warm air, and slowly internal part slightly melts, and that acts like an insulator. Basically, what happens? They have enough warmth inside and cold outside. They can survive throughout the night by building houses temporarily like that in those climates. Okay, so they utilize this type of phenomena culturally. The housing and also clothing is adapted as per the temperatures, and also their food habits also are adjusted to those components. Okay, right. So I'm going to stop the class here. So tomorrow I'm going to briefly talk to you about how people respond socially. There are some weird behaviors that you see in these people, especially in Eskimos. You notice that some studies have shown some weird behavior of people, some social